Hello, and welcome to the CivilNet podcast. I'm your host, Paul Vartan Sukiasyan. Today's guest is just back from a trip to the United States, where he got an inside look at U.S.-Armenia relations and the chance to meet with numerous policymakers and academics on the subject. He's someone whose work and analysis I've followed for years, so I'm really excited to host him. Tigran Grigoryan, Director of the Regional Center for Democracy and Security. Thanks for being here.
Hi, Paul. Thank you for having me.
Oh, of course. It's all pleasure is all mine. So your trip was an extensive one. You saw all four corners of the country, basically. In fact, you've probably seen more of my country than I have at this point. So what did you gather about how the U.S. views Armenia from it?
Yeah, as you know, it's a very volatile period now in the U.S. With the domestic politics basically playing the main part in all the discussions. When it comes to the relationship, the U.S. relationship with regions like ours, a couple of things should be underlined. First of all, there is still this lack of bureaucratic appointments that make the policymaking process easier. Let's take the State Department. I mean, all the main high-ranking officials have been appointed, but if you look at the level below, there are still a lot of vacant places. And
I heard they just laid off like 1,400 people or something like that as well. They're losing.
Apart from that, you don't have really people who work on countries like Armenia on a lower level. You still have, of course, I mean, the Caucasus desk and stuff like that. But on the level above there, the places, the vacancies are still there. The second problem is with the foreign policy making style of the new administration. So in this administration, people like Steve Witkoff, who are special envoys of the president, are playing a bigger role than let's say some of the State Department officials. So when it comes to the Armenia-Azerbaijan negotiations, for example, the special envoys are mainly involved, and they have been involved for months now. And we learned that there is an actual process going on, and as we were learning about that, this has become common knowledge as well with all the latest publications about the U.S. involvement.
With Armenia, Azerbaijan, the region. And
stuff like that. To be honest, before visiting the U.S., I had a more skeptical view on the U.S.-Armenia bilateral relations. My thinking was that the new administration is like busy with a lot of other things, that the South Caucasus is not a priority, and that the document, for example, the strategic partnership charter that was signed with the previous administration is probably not as relevant as it should be. But the good thing is that there are some processes going on. These processes are not visible, but the strategic partnership agenda is still kind of relevant, and things are being discussed which are not that big or that important, but they are still there. So negotiations on building a new nuclear power plant in Armenia, for example, a lot of other things that were envisaged by this document. So the process is ongoing, but this objective or subjective problems we've just discussed are kind of impeding the process or the pace of it.
The same thing. The conventional wisdom was that the Trump administration wouldn't really care, and during the first administration we actually saw a lot more support for Azerbaijan than Armenia. So I was pretty dour on what happened, but it's been very surprising. They're actually more active than the Biden administration, in my opinion, at this point.
I think it's not about them being more active. I think the Biden administration was very active in this last 2 years, and the U.S. played a stabilizing role when it came to Armenia-Azerbaijan. I think the main difference is in style of negotiations. Like the Biden administration was more of a conventional administration, with the State Department being more involved and stuff like that. Here with the Trump administration, things are being done quicker. Like, let's say these Armenia-Azerbaijan talks, let's take the Armenia-Azerbaijan talks on the opening of communications. I mean, They have been involved for a couple of months, and now we're discussing a concrete, very specific proposal on unblocking. With the previous administration, similar discussions were taking place, but they weren't that effective. And with this transactional foreign policy, it's probably easier to make things done. And that's the reason that we're seeing some progress on this track, for example.
Well, speaking of that corridor, we had just a few days ago, Tom Barrack, the ambassador of U.S. to Turkey, made a statement which has been very controversial, saying that the U.S. should take a 100-year lease over the period and that all the sides will share in this corridor. Now, was he speaking just his opinion? The Armenia has actually already pushed back on that, saying that there is no giving up of sovereignty. Anything being discussed, which he said there are things being discussed with the U.S., but it cannot impinge on sovereignty, though critics are already saying, no, this is going to take away from sovereignty. So, yeah, what is going on? What's behind that plan and what's going on there?
Yeah, so Tom Barrack's statement actually created a lot of confusion in Armenia. The pro-government media and the activists who support the government have started accusing the U.S. ambassador of kind of distorting the reality of the things that are being discussed. The Armenian Foreign Ministry, if I'm not mistaken, reacted to the statement, and the Prime Minister's spokesperson also said, Armenia is not discussing anything which would kind of endanger or question its sovereignty. But then we had the press conference of the Prime Minister himself, where this topic was discussed extensively. So if we compare both of these statements, a couple of things are clear. There is a clear and very specific U.S. involvement in the process, and I think this topic of unblocking of communications was the main point being discussed in during the recent negotiations in Abu Dhabi. The second thing is the nature of this solution. As I understand, judging by the statements made by the Prime Minister himself, the sides are being offered a solution that would outsource not the communication itself, not the territory itself, but the building of infrastructure on this communication. Let's say a railway on this southern communication, and a foreign private company would do that, and then it would probably also be responsible for providing security on this road. The Armenian government is saying, this does not question Armenia's sovereignty over this part of the territory in any way. But I think here the details are much more important. Of course, we haven't read this plan yet. It hasn't been published. But the big questions to be asked is who will be controlling this communication in practice. I think yes. I mean, all the sides will recognize Armenia's sovereignty over the communication and stuff like that. But the bigger question is who will be in charge of the railway, who will be in charge of security. The Prime Minister has said that Armenian law enforcement agencies will have access to all the parts of this communication, but that's not the main question. Let's say there is this project going on, this private company is building infrastructure there, a railway, and then it's controlling the railway. It's also providing security on the railway. What is the relationship between the Armenian government and this private company? How this relationship will work out? The second question is, of course, the issue of reciprocity. For many months, while talking about the unblocking of communications, the Armenian government has been emphasizing that, there should be reciprocity. Reciprocity meaning that whatever regulations are on Armenian soil, these regulations should be also in place on the Azerbaijani territory. So if, let's say, Azerbaijani vehicles or Azerbaijani cargo are passing through the Armenian territory with very specific regulations, then the Armenian cargoes and vehicles should also be able to use at least the territory of Nakhchivan to connect with the northern part of the country from the southern part. So I don't think this is happening. I don't think Azerbaijan will ever agree to any specific regulations or constraints on its sovereignty. So it's very interesting that in his recent press conference, the prime minister wasn't mentioning the principle of reciprocity. He was talking about sovereignty, jurisdiction, and stuff like that, but I didn't hear the word reciprocity. So this could be considered a concession already on the Armenian government side. And yeah, as I've said, of course, it's very hard to judge the plan while it's not published. You know, we're hearing some bits and pieces from different places. There have been, you know, some publications in the international media, and we have statements coming from various sides. But from what we know at this point, yeah, I think Armenia will probably have less control over the communication than in other parts of the country. So this is already a kind of a concession, and Azerbaijan would not make that reciprocal. That's another concession. So if we're talking in formal terms, yes, Armenia's sovereignty over that connection or over that communication won't be questioned, but in practice, the reality might be very different.
And it just leaves me with the question, you know, what is the end goal of doing this? Like, for example, if Armenia gives this to Azerbaijan but gets nothing in return, I mean, it doesn't even clear the way for the signing of a peace treaty, so to speak, because, I mean, Azerbaijan still wants a constitution change, and now they keep moving the bar. They're talking about letting all these Azerbaijanis from the Soviet era come back to Armenia. Again, no reciprocity, no Armenians that were, you know, massacred or pogromed out of Azerbaijan, and let alone the Artsaksis are allowed to go back. And so all I hear is more and more desire from Azerbaijan for things, but you know, what is Armenia's reason for playing ball, except for perhaps that it has no choice?
First of all, we need to understand that these are two separate tracks, the opening of communications and the peace treaty agenda. So they are not formally connected to each other. We might have a solution on one track, and then we might not have a solution on the other. So when it comes to the communications, I think the hope is that after opening this main communication, which is of utmost importance to Azerbaijan, then all the communications in the region will be opened, and that's the vision of the Armenian government outlined in this Crossroads of Peace agenda. But here as well, there are very serious concerns that Azerbaijan won't follow up on the process after getting what it needs most. We had this example with the delimitation process last spring, when Armenia made some concessions at the start of the process, hoping that that would open the way for kind of continuing the delimitation process. But that process has been frozen since, so we haven't had any progress, even in parts of the mutual border which are not controversial. So there's nothing to be argued about, let alone the parts where Azerbaijan occupies Armenian sovereign territory. So the hope is that, you know, by making this concession, Azerbaijan will be willing to kind of continue the process and open all of the communications that existed during the Soviet period. That would in turn also create an opportunity for Armenia-Turkey normalization and opening of the Armenian-Turkish border. So that's the vision here in Armenia. Also, of course, there's also this risks that Azerbaijan, if there is no solution on this issue, Azerbaijan might use force to actually get some concessions. But as I've been saying recently, the fact that Azerbaijan is still capable of kind of threatening and blackmailing Armenia with a new war or a new escalation is the responsibility of the Armenian government. Because it's been like 5 years since the end of the Second Karabakh War. We have been hearing statements about reform in the military, about improving the security environment, but the fact of the matter is that on the ground, Azerbaijan is still using these blackmail tactics to basically extort concessions from Armenia. When it comes to the peace treaty agenda, here, as you know, the main precondition is still in place. Baku still wants to Baku still demands from Armenia to change its constitution, and it's not doable before the 2026 parliamentary elections. So here we have a time problem. And even after that, it's not understandable whether the Armenian government will be capable of actually implementing these constitutional changes, because they are very controversial. And whatever the government does, the perception is there that these changes are being imposed by Azerbaijan. In terms of this narrative about Western Azerbaijan, I think at this point it is still more of a mirror narrative being used by Baku to kind of counter any claims or any positions, not just in Armenia but also in the world, that kind of emphasize that the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh should return. You know, they are trying to counter the right to return of Karabakh Armenians by using that, but it's a very dangerous narrative, of course. If you repeat these same false claims periodically, if you include them in your, textbooks,
it becomes real to them.
At some point it could become real, and the government might lose control over the narrative. So at this point, I don't think that there is like a real demand on the Azerbaijani side to allow this thing to happen. But yeah, it is being used for tactical reasons at this point, but it might get out of control.
Well, the situation that you've set up is one in which, Azerbaijan holds all the cards, as the saying goes, and there is nothing really much for Armenia in there unless Azerbaijan says so. Now, we had a big surprise back on Monday where President Trump, so we're at the highest level now, said that there is a successful conclusion coming for the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict, that it may be at hand. And so clearly whatever is happening and the things that you were kind of witnessing when you were in D.C. has risen to that level, that the president's getting briefed on it. And so that implies that the U.S. is serious about something. But I guess, what are they? Are they just looking at the corridor? That's it. I know they have their reasons for wanting all the borders to be open. But are they willing to go to the point of putting some kind of pressure on Azerbaijan? Because really, it looks like Azerbaijan is just in it for itself. And so the U.S. is trying to protect its own interests, and its interests don't necessarily line up with what Azerbaijan wants from here. So what's going on with that?
First of all, let me remind to our viewers and listeners that this kind of statements have been made since 2022 at least. Like, I remember Secretary Blinken saying that, the peace is very visible, and an agreement could be signed by the end of the year, and they have been saying this for many years now. So that statement alone doesn't prove anything. But the fact that there is an active U.S. involvement in the process is another factor. And I think there is a high level involvement in the process. As I understand from my conversations in D.C., Vice President Vance is, for example, monitoring the situation, briefing on the situation to President Trump. So there is a high-level involvement, and also President Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, is the main man, the focal point of this process. This is his idea, basically. Regarding the chances of success, here I think Armenia is inclined to kind of accept this proposal, because the thinking here in Yerevan is possibly that it's better than Russian control. So if we need to concede some sort of control over that territory, it's better to have a private company. And also, their hope is that there will be some sort of Armenian involvement as well. So the Prime Minister is talking about a joint Armenian-American consortium. I don't think that's realistic, but that's the view at this point. But of course, here Azerbaijan's perceptions are also important. I've been monitoring the Azerbaijani press and the pro-government experts and trying to understand what they're thinking. And a lot of concerns have been raised about this specific proposal, the main point of which has been that by agreeing to the allocation or to control of this communication by a US company, even if it's a private company, Azerbaijan would kind of spoil its relations with Iran, because Iran naturally is not inclined to have any kind of foreign presence on its border. The other thing, and also the relationship with Russia is important. At this point, they have a crisis in the relationship, but in strategic sense, of course, Azerbaijan tries to conduct this policy of equidistance, and kind of spoiling the relationship with Russia in the long term is not their intention. So excluding Russia is also problematic for Azerbaijan, as I understand. The other thing is that Azerbaijan's policy in the region in recent years has been described as this policy of kind of neutralizing Western influence in the South Caucasus. And in that sense, their positions are quite similar with the Russian position. Let's remember all the attempts by the West to get involved in the region actively. Let's remember the Brussels meeting between Pashinyan, von der Leyen, and Blinken. I think you do remember the reaction from Baku, that it's an attempt to change the regional balance and all of that. Also, let's remember what's the Azerbaijani position on the EU monitoring mission, which is deployed on Armenian soil. It's not even like on the border. They are against it. And why would they welcome an international organization on their border if they are against the EU mission? So here the big question is not whether Armenia will agree or not agree to this proposal. As I've said, I'm pretty sure Yerevan is kind of on board with the proposal. The big question is what's the Azerbaijani position and on the matter. And as I've said, there are some signs that they are not as enthusiastic about this as some might think.
So there's one more aspect when you talk about U.S.-Armenian relations that we didn't touch on yet, and that is the diaspora. So we've known for having a very powerful lobby, for example. At least we punch above our weight. What did you see when it comes to the diaspora's influence on any kind of potential U.S. relations?
Yeah, during all of our meetings, our interlocutors were singling out the fact that there is a big Armenian community in the U.S. and that could be used to promote Armenia's interests. But the problem now is that some of the diasporan organizations and the Armenian government have very different agendas. You could even argue they're at war with each other, given also the domestic political situation in Armenia, where these organizations, parent organizations, are being targeted by the Armenian government. And this has been the case since the revolution, basically. And I think there is a problem on both sides. If we're talking about the diaspora organizations, I think there is too much emphasis on domestic politics. So at times you could have an impression that, they are working more against the Armenian government itself than against Azerbaijan, let's say. And on the Armenian government side, I think there is this lack of willingness to engage with these organizations. I understand that they do not agree on many things, but I think there should be at least some issues they agree on. Let's say the issue of Armenia's security, the fact that Armenia should be invaded or Armenia should be attacked. I think that this is a point that every Armenian in the world agrees to. And the fact that they cannot find a consensus, even on these very primitive and very superficial issues, is very telling. Because Armenia is losing a huge resource that could be used in the domestic political process in the US to promote Armenian interests. And the diaspora, not the diaspora, I think it's very wrong to generalize while talking about diaspora is very diverse. We're talking about the big organizations that function there. These organizations should also kind of be able to separate their disagreements with the current government from the natural viable interest of the Republic of Armenia. If that doesn't happen, I mean, we're losing a huge resource, as I've said, because there are not too many things that Armenia could use in the work with the current administration, let's say. One of them is the existence of the Armenian community, and this opportunity is being lost.
Yeah, that's right. Because if there's one thing I could tell Prime Minister Pashinyan as a diasporan, is that we are not a monolith. There are all sorts of people. We're not just the ones that yell at him when he goes abroad. But then on the other side, I really think we've lost the plot. I've been involved in Armenian lobby groups for basically my whole life. I've gone and lobbied in DC for so many years, and it was always, Armenia first. And as Armenian Americans, what we care about is the defense of Armenia, the strength of Armenia, its ability. It wasn't about a particular party or about a particular person in charge. But as Armenian Americans, what is it about the domestic politics in Armenia? It really is irrelevant. So I feel like as a diaspora, we've lost our way on that. But at the same time, there are reasons for those issues with the government. So thank you so much, Tigran, for being here. You gave us just such an amazing, just download of everything that you've gotten over the past couple of weeks. And really, I think helps to put us in a better situation of understanding where we are. So thank you for being here.
Thank you, Paul.
And thank you for joining the CivilNet podcast.